Good morning, Daniel.
Good morning, Dan.
What's the scoop of the week?
Scoop. What are we, journalists?
Hard hitting, just the facts.
Right. Well, anyways, want to talk about three different things today. The first is giving children an allowance. Then I want to discuss how you should, if at all, discuss money with your friends, families, colleagues. And then once again, kind of broach the topic of separating your self worth from your net worth.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, so giving kids money, talking about money with all sorts of people, and then trying not to think too much about your own money. Fun set of topics. Hit me. What do we want to talk about first?
Well, I figured, coming from two planners who at present have a grand total of zero children, I
That we know
figured,
of.
right, right. I figured who more qualified to have the conversation on allowance and giving children a stipend and some sort of money. I guess first and foremost, it's a interesting thought because like what is an allowance? Is this money they're supposed to use to live on, or is this money they're supposed to have as an extra, or is it one of these things in practice we just see as a it depends on a family basis?
I think net allowance really should be more or less respective to how much you place on your children as self sufficiency or things they're supposed to be sort of managing for themselves versus what you're providing. So when I say that to give sort of the two extremes, imagine you have a teenager, and on one hand or one end of the spectrum, you essentially make all their meals, you buy all their clothes directly, you buy all their school supplies, you pay for everything directly for them, such that they effectively have no need for money to meet their needs. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have a teenager who's old enough that you're saying, like, look, here's money. You need to buy your own clothes, buy your own school supplies, budget appropriately for how many times you're going to eat out and so on. And, if you run short of money, too bad, kid. And, most kids, I think, live on some version of a spectrum between those. But, on the first end, you essentially would have almost no allowance or almost no need for an allowance. On the other end, you'd have something like not a like full adult income, but we're talking about probably well north of $100 a month, to provide for that. So I think most kids are going to land somewhere on a spectrum in between, and then also, of course, respective to their age and kind of the expense that's adequate for their needs.
I think you mentioned teenager a few times. Do you think that is usually an appropriate time to start thinking about this type of stipend?
No, I mean, I think an allowance is practical much earlier because you have, in academic terms, you have the theory of family financial socialization, in which parents teach deliberate money lessons, right? A penny saved is a penny earned, or pay yourself first, or those sorts of, colloquial lessons. But also, money handling skills, right? Like here's how you count change, here's how, the value of different currencies, and how much money you do or don't give a kid at a certain age is really reflective of that. So, for example, when I was growing up, my allowance was essentially $1 per year of age, which is not a good like inflation adjusted rate for it. But effectively, when I was six, my allowance was six. When I was seven, my allowance was seven, and that was on a weekly basis. And that was something that kind of I think by around the age of 6 or 7, I had to do chores to earn. So if I didn't do chores, I didn't get an allowance. If I did chores, I did get an allowance, and that kind of went until I was about 14 or 15. And then, I got a after school job and summer job and started making real money, quote unquote, and that sort of went away. But that was sort of the basic approach was we're going to connect money to work, to deliverable life skills and responsible activities in the household. And those chores steadily expanded over time to encompass more and more, as also the amount of allowance expanded for that. And that's just sort of one way to approach it, is to tie an appropriate amount of work for a child to an appropriate amount of money for that child, and how much you're trying to make them self-sufficient versus reliant upon you, and what's appropriate for that individual.
I think that's one of the best opportunities for an allowance is allowing it to be something where you can teach the child skills like investing, budgeting, or the value of their time, or the fact you have to work for certain things. If you don't mind me asking, you said you had this allowance up until the time you had gotten a part-time job. Was there anything that you took away from it and learned from having the allowance?
It sort of created almost this passive subconscious expectation that I had to do the various chores related to the allowance because I always wanted more stuff than I had money for, right? Like, I wanted that Xbox 360 and I wanted also a PS2. But I also, wanted Warhammer figurines and I wanted to, be able to buy Chipotle occasionally. Like there's little things like that where functionally, buying almost anything of any real value took a month or two at a time because like a video game, even back in the aughts, was $60. Well, if you're making, let's say, $13 allowance as a 13-year-old, it's going to take you a month to earn that much money, let alone if you spend any of the money along the way. So, it just created this thing like I am going to clean the house. I am going to, clean the bathroom and mow the lawn and do all those things. Because if I don't, I won't get to have those things. And the want for those things is more important than my desire to be lazy.
I think you had a fair allowance, right? It wasn't, as you mentioned, 1 week's worth of chores got you the Xbox or the game or whatever. It took time, and you had to work toward it. And I think that makes an interesting point, or brings up a question for me: is there a point where the allowance becomes considerably more of an entitlement, and is no longer promoting independence or good financial habits?
Yeah, you're asking a really great question here. I think there's a really good book on this by Ron Lieber called The Opposite of Spoiled that really dives into how you weigh the balance between entitlement versus necessity, right? And sort of back to the extremes. I think it is inhibiting to a child to say something like, I'm not going to ever give you an allowance or money or anything like that, because you're reducing their ability to make decisions about money, to learn those skills, right? To make a bad purchase or to weigh the decision to save for something with more staying power versus something temporary like a chocolate bar or something like that. I think the balance of kind of what is appropriate is sort of there's a little bit of a keeping up with the Joneses thing here. I would say an appropriate allowance has to be reflective not only of the actual kind of work done to earn it, and again, age appropriate amounts and so on, but also then of making sure that your child is not put in a position to sort of be uh, othered by their peer group, right? Where you either have given them not nearly enough to kind of keep up with their peers, right? So think of like the Stanley Cup fad in the last year or two. You would want to be able to. Yeah, it should be reasonable that your child could get that if they wanted to save towards it and buy it. Or conversely, on the other side of this, what you shouldn't be doing is be giving them so much money that they're that friend who just always has money, who is sort of spoiled. That's a really tough line to walk. And I think the really challenging thing here is it's not the same amount of money for every single kid and every single family, nor is it even the same amount of money for two kids in the same family. Or at the same age. Again, I said like my allowance was essentially $1 per year of age. That's probably not adequate today, right? Just inflation over 20 years or so. $6 for a 6 year old is not really adequate for a 6 year old. At the same time, does it need to be 50 or $100? Probably not. So it's just a question of really, at the end of the day, are we tailoring what we provide our children with to their needs and what's respectively appropriate for their peers and building the skill set? Or are we handicapping them by not giving them enough? Or are we overindulging them and giving them too much?
That's a really good point about, look, if one of their peers has this Stanley Cup or whatever, can they afford it and can they work toward it? But at the same time, are they not the person that can afford three of them and then show off to their friends because their allowance is twice of maybe their peers? I'd say my last thought there is when it comes to giving, the money and tying it to some sort of responsibility. Do you, I guess, give any thought to how they spend or use the money? So, for example, do you get into the details on, wow, they've saved all of it? I should encourage them to spend it. Or every time they get $5, they instantly spend it. Maybe I should have a conversation with them about delaying gratification and how eventually saving does build up and have that conversation. Or do you kind of just take it individually?
I think, well, I mean, it's always individual. I think the appropriate answer here is not to rush the conversation either way, whether they're spending everything or saving everything. I think you want to give kids room to sort of learn from their mistakes going either direction, right? Like if they're so cheap as to be considered miserly or a penny pincher by their peers, that will create sort of a negative feedback loop that will get them to potentially start spending more at a certain point. And if they find themselves always out of money and they're always kind of tugging on your shirt sleeve saying, I need more money, mom, I need more money, dad, I don't have enough, it's not fair, my friends have this, blah, blah, blah. And you're looking at them going, well, because you keep spending all your money on little things instead of building up enough money to buy big things. I think it's okay to give them room to make those decisions for themselves and to politely point out the problem when the problem presents itself without putting a lot of judgment on it. So, there's the whole thing of like paying yourself first. So, penny saved, penny earned, save 10%, whatever. I think it's helpful to tell your children that that's a good idea. And then it's valuable for them to learn to do that kind of their own volition, or to otherwise fail to learn that and then to suffer the consequences, because we often experience negative things more strongly than we experience positive things. And so those negative experiences, when well calibrated, can be really valuable teaching moments.
I like that. I think my first reaction or instinct would have been, if I see someone spending it immediately, to be like, you don't understand, you save it for the long term. And I think giving each child, the space to make those mistakes, even if you don't consider them mistakes, and allow them to almost learn from them themselves, because, the experiences we have firsthand are what are going to shape our views with money to a certain extent, just as much as the things we see or observe. And I think that's really wise.
And I think functionally, again, the whole purpose of an allowance is to help build money skills and provide something for this child or these children. But I think our role, as parents and guardians and so on, is to build these skills in children. And everybody's going to have sort of a natural point, right? They're a space saver, they're a spender, they want stuff, they're not big on stuff, whatever it is. And you just need to sort of monitor that and calibrate your feedback to ensure that they end up at kind of a healthy medium.
Excellent. So whether it's the student bragging about their allowance to their peers, or whether it's me talking to my colleagues about how much I make, or a family member about how much I'm spending, I want to talk about just discussing money with your peers. I thought it would be wise or interesting to break it down into families, friends, and just colleagues. So I wanted to start with family. I don't think we need to talk about the importance of having these conversations with a partner if you're engaged, married, planning on um, joining finances together. But what about an extended family? I think the first question that came to mind for me was parents. We have some families we work with, and one of the big questions we ask, it's not something that's fun to talk about, but is along the lines of, do you foresee having to take care in any capacity of your parents now or down the line? And some families say, well, my mom's or father's situation is this, and I know in 5 years they'll run out of money, and this is the situation. And there's other people who say, my parents have never once had the conversation with me. I very well may have to take care of them. However, I have no idea. Um, should you, as a son or daughter, take a vested interest in your parents' finances and really know the extent of them?
I think there's gradients to this. So I think by the time your kids are teenagers, or you're the kid and you're talking to your parents, I think it's reasonable to have a general, maybe not like down to the dollar, but like just a general understanding of like what do my parents make. And a lot of people hearing that might go like, oh, I don't think it's appropriate. I don't want my kids to think about how much money I earn or how much we do or don't make or whatever the context is. But here's the reason why I think that's really valuable. I think it's valuable because there's a psychological construct known as anchoring. And anchoring is sort of the basic point that the first data point we become aware of becomes sort of the revolving center of our future discourse around that. And so, if your parents are, let's say, a teacher and a software engineer, I think it's really meaningful for your kids to understand, hey, I'm the teacher, I make 60,000, 70,000, $80,000 a year, and I've been doing this for 10, 15, 20 years. And my wife, my husband, my partner makes $200,000 a year, and they've been doing it for just as long as I have. And so even though we both leave home, we go to work, we do work for a living, we're paid very different amounts. I think it's very helpful for kids to understand about their parents and about their finances because that can help inform their own decisions about kind of what they do and don't want to have or earn in their own lives. Right? Some people work to live, some people live to work, but also some people really focus on the financial outcomes of their work. Some people really focus on the impact outcomes of their work. And it can be really meaningful for kids to contextualize it because what they may hear from their parents the whole time they're growing up is, I love being a teacher. I love being a lawyer. I love being a doctor. Or I hate being a teacher. I hate being a doctor. I hate being a lawyer. Or I don't like the amount of hours I have to work. Or I love the flexibility that my work has. Like there's all these qualitative things that we very happily share with other people about our work. But money is such an important piece, right? Nobody works for free, generally speaking. And so, in that context, when we omit money from that conversation with young children and with developing children, we're often setting up people to do something like, follow your dreams, follow your heart. And there's nothing wrong with that wisdom. But when we say that to somebody who says, like, well, I want to be an artist, okay, you can make money being an artist, but there's a big difference between trying to sell paintings and being a graphic designer. And so there's a balance to saying, like, look, money is an important part of this conversation. So to your question, I know you were thinking more about like adult parents and long-term care and questions like that. But I think starting that conversation at a reasonable age, something like 10 to 12, is valuable. You can be very general and kind of simplistic early on. But as your kids are getting older, I think it's very valuable for you to have a conversation with them about what you make, why you make what you do, why you do what you do, because that can help them have better informed decisions about their own life and development path.
No, I think that's a great way to start it, even before the "Hey, my parents are aging," long-term care conversation. It's when, the children are a little younger, and you don't have to get into the full details, but I think starting that conversation earlier than later allows you to build upon it and add further detail over time as situations change and as the children grow, mature, and just know more about money and finances and what taxes are. And I think that's really interesting. Um, I'd say it sounds like this is a conversation that should be happening in almost middle school. Do you think that at that age they're at a point where they can internalize some of that information? I try to think about when I was in middle school, and I'm not sure what I would have done or how I would have applied that to my life if I knew my parents made $50,000 a year, $100,000 a year.
Well, and to some extent, you don't really know how to contextualize that, right? Like the first time I ever learned about something that my parents made or either of them earned, I think I was in middle school or very early high school, and I think I had a class project where like you were supposed to ask like mom, dad, what do you do? How much do you earn? And I don't think, and my dad was actually retired at that exact time, so I knew the answer was nothing. But my mother at the time said I make $70,000 a year, and in 2001, 2002 money, whatever exactly it was at that time, that was an unfathomable amount of money to me. Like I immediately did sort of dumb kid math where I was like, well, hold on, you could definitely just like buy me an Xbox, no problem. Like very selfish, very internally focused. But in that context, right, like I didn't really know what that meant, but I at least now had an anchor. I had an understanding of what a woman in her, mid late 40s, working in, for a not a government agency, but a sort of a government affiliated organization with her level of experience and tenure and so on was earning. And that gave me some grounding and expectations. Okay, some people definitely make more or less, but like now I have an idea. Because up to a certain point, you just have these vague notions like, well, teachers don't make a lot, doctors do make a lot, lawyers do make a lot, some lawyers, not all lawyers. And so, like, it's easy to get kind of sucked into that frame of reference. And so I think it was very helpful to even hear that at a certain point. So I think middle school is about the right time. Now, again, I think you can start very general. I don't think you have to say like, well, I make $90,000 a year. And that means that as a percentile of the American public, I'm at the 84th percentile or something. I don't think you have to get into that. But I think it's helpful to start that conversation earlier because conversely, to the point that you were trying to raise originally with long-term care stuff, we do talk to people all the time. It's like, I don't know what my parents' situation is, but I do think one day I'm going to have to help them. Well, here's sort of my posited alternative to that. If your parents, your grandparents, whoever it is in this context, aren't willing to talk to you about their finances, but they are willing to tacitly acknowledge that they one day may burden you with their care or their uptake, I think it's very fair of you to say, if that's your expectation, then I have a fair expectation to know about your finances. And if you're not going to tell me, I'm not going to help you because you're essentially just saying one day I'm going to drop a problem in your lap at an indeterminate time, and the severity of that problem is also indeterminate, and you just have to absorb that. And that is an incredibly unkind thing to do to somebody that you call your children, right? Or your beloved son, your beloved daughter.
Well said. How about friends? I think, what do they say? Something along the lines of like, you don't discuss money, politics, or sex in polite company. But I have some friends, and maybe it's just because what I do for work, that are fairly comfortable telling me how much they make, whatever their student loans are, or whatever the case may be. That even have the privilege of working with some of them. But for me personally, to make an argument for it, I think it's nice to just have a general idea of where people with similar educations or similar backgrounds stand, how they're pursuing in their career, the things they enjoy versus not, what they're getting paid for that, and maybe some of the upcoming costs and things they're struggling with. I think it kind of helps make that and put that into perspective for people me and my age. But some people completely despise having that conversation and, say that's something that we shouldn't talk about, it's taboo. And I wanted to get your perspective on that.
I think there's a tasteful line to be drawn in talking about money, and that tasteful line really just depends on what would be gauche versus what would be appropriate. So, for example, if anybody asks me what do I earn, I'll tell them like without hesitation, down to the dollar and penny. And I'll be perfectly honest, like I could go look it up on my computer right now exactly what I pay myself as the owner of the practice. I think it's like 178,000. I think it's somewhere in that neighborhood, and like that's a very specific number. And for some people listening, they'll be surprised, like, oh, it's a lot of money. And some people be like, oh, I would think as a financial planner you'd make more. Like everybody has again this anchoring response to that sort of data point. And my friends know that I make that much or about that much. I'm not shy with that fact at all, but it's not to be braggadocious or otherwise to sort of inflate ego or to kind of like pump my chest and go, haha, look at how well I'm doing in life. It's just being transparent because I acknowledge, particularly in kind of my friend group from like, call it like a middle school, high school type of friend group, if I'm not the most financially successful, I'm very close to being the most financially successful. And so when I share that sort of thing with them, it's not because I want them to know that I'm successful and to feel that. It's because I'm trying to give them a frame of reference. Like, look, you can do better for yourself. I have a friend who has essentially worked in tech support for about the last decade at this point, or maybe even a little bit longer. I don't think he has ever done better than maybe $40,000 or $50,000 a year, but he has a degree in like software development, and I'm like, dude, like you can do, like I know you can do better, and I want you to do better, and so I'm going to encourage you and support you and try to nudge you in that direction, and I'm gonna try my best for that. But I think the gauche line that I mentioned earlier is when you talk about your money as a point of superiority, right? When you say, like, well, because I earn so much, I must be that much better or smarter or whatever than anybody else. I don't put myself any higher or lower on a spectrum than any of my friends or peers because I recognize that some are doing fine, some are struggling, some have had more luck than others or had a better starting point than others. But in that conversation, in that emphasis, the reason I think it's important to be able to talk about money with your friends is not to, establish a hierarchy of success. It's to encourage each other to be more successful in the most meaningful way to each individual, whether that means money or whether that means more of a qualitative life experience.
So from what I've kind of heard you say, it sounds like you would support in some degree having these conversations with your friends.
I mean, 100%. Again, I think if you enter the conversation or if somebody else enters the conversation and the tone of the conversation is, well, how much do you make? Okay, I make more than you. I go on top. I'm now somehow better. That's not okay because that's creating sort of this emphasis on the inequality between you and ascribing sort of a moral superiority to a numerical value. But for example, I would say somebody who, let's say, makes $70,000 a year and loves what they do is better off than somebody who makes $90,000 a year and can't wait for every weekend and every vacation day to come around. I think there's a meaningful distinction to be drawn between that. But I think it's helpful to have conversations about income with your friends, even with your colleagues, which I know is sort of the next tier you want to talk about, because I think it's important for us to acknowledge and recognize when we maybe aren't doing as well as we should be in light of our energy experience, where we are in life, and so on. And that's not to say, like, oh, if you're a teacher and you're not making as much as that software developer, you should stop being a teacher. That's not really the point. My point is more so like, is it reasonable? Are you doing okay? Because, and I say this as an employer, right? The only people who win when you're not willing to discuss money are the people who decide how much you make. And so in that context, it's helpful to have, warm, comfortable conversations with your peers about your earnings, about your goals and objectives and life ambitions. Because it's also important in things like going out to eat or sharing experiences, wanting to take a trip, right? If one of you is making $250,000 a year, one of you is making $50,000 a year, is it reasonable that the $250,000 a year person says every single weekend, hey, let's go out? Let's spend $100 a person on dinner. Let's spend $50 on drinks after that. Let's go see this show. Tickets are $150. That's cool, right? Like, you're having a very different life experience. And if you don't acknowledge the financial inequities between you, that sets you up to essentially have one person be keeping up with the Joneses all the time and one person be the Joneses. And the problem is that for one of you, that's a sustainable behavior. And for one of you, that can be very financially harmful.
It's a really good point. I had a friend from another life that we had this issue with. Every time we went out, he was fairly well off, and he would just assume everybody else could pay for the $100 dinner, the $50 for drinks, or whatever the case may be. Until somebody just said to him one day, "Hey, I flat out can't afford to do the things that we've been doing," and it wasn't malicious or anything. He was simply just unaware. He's like, I was ignorant to the fact that these were things that I could afford and do, but they're not things that you could. And I think that's, part of the value of that conversation is you don't have to know to the dollar how much, you're saving and how much you're making from your current position. But I do think having those conversations helps to set nice guidelines and expectations for just how you'll be friends and which type of vacations and dinners and events you'll go to and, how often you want to see each other.
Yeah, and it's also okay to have, if you have a really comfortable relationship, to just say, like, I'll subsidize, not like in a keeping track sort of way. But for example, this past weekend, Caitlin and I went out with some friends, and when we asked, hey, do you want to go out? They said point blank, like, no, we've spent way too much money today on these things we need for our house and so on. We really can't afford it. And I said, like, what, I got you. And so we ended up spending, between dinner, drinks, and so on, I think we spent something like $350, right, across four people. So, you go there, okay, well, gosh, we spent $175 on our friends. Yes, but they told us it wasn't reasonable for them at the outset. We said we're fine. We ate that for them, right? We took care of them for that, and there's no expectation or any belief here that they're going to get us next time or something like that. It's a decision that we made. We were willing to spend the money we had, the permission we had, to enjoy this experience with our friends, and that wouldn't have been possible if they weren't comfortable saying, sorry, we can't afford it this time, or if we had never had a conversation where we had a basic understanding of the fact that we do better than these friends financially, and that's not a moral failing on their part or a success on our part, but that it's not reasonable for us to just say, you should be willing to drop $175 this weekend to go out with us because we asked.
All right. So, lastly, colleagues, I actually came up with this topic because I was those like YouTube shorts that come up sometimes when you're just scrolling on social media. And there was one that came up for, I believe, the show House, the doctor show. And one of the physicians was looking at a pay stub and realized that he was making considerably less than all the other physicians he worked with. So he just started going around and asking them and inquiring. And he found out, yeah, I'm making like half of what they're all making. And I realized how important that might be in a work setting, right? Is as you mentioned earlier, the only person who benefits from you not having that information is the employer because they don't have to justify paying you more. So I'd assume in this context too, it's one of the reasons as a firm we try to be so transparent. And the reason I could tell you how much I make to a dollar is because it's important to share that information and probably something you believe colleagues should be doing amongst themselves.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, let's just get a foundational thing out of the way. It doesn't matter what employment agreement you sign or contract you sign, whatever it is, you have an inalienable right in the United States to talk about your compensation with your colleagues, with your peers, with the people you work with. If the company says it's against policy, if they say, well, your employment agreement says you won't, doesn't matter, right? That is a policy that they cannot legally actually enforce upon you. That's an employment term they cannot enforce upon you. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't get written up or that you won't get in trouble or fired or let go. If that ever happens, congratulations, you have a slam dunk lawsuit. If your company ever punishes you in a serious sense for talking about your compensation, so let's just get that legal foundation out of the way. But yeah, I mean the basic fact of the matter is everybody in the organization except for the employer, and I'll even argue in a second why the employer wins with this anyway. But everybody in the organization wins. Every colleague, every coworker wins when you're willing to have conversations about what you earn for the work that you do. Period. That I will die on that hill. Fight me.
Okay, and you said something about the employer still benefits in that regard.
The funny thing is that I think employers can waste a ton of time trying to price the value of individuals. So like I look at you, Daniel. I say, well, Daniel's a enrolled agent. He's got 4 or 5 years experience as a financial advisor. Like he's a really hard worker. He's very professional. Like I think the value of Daniel is this. Right. And conversely, I look at Emily and Emily, she's very nice, but she's just not Daniel. I'm gonna price Daniel and Emily differently based on how I perceive and value individually their various points of their background, so on and so forth. You can waste a ton of time and energy on that. And that is a pointless exercise in my book. And the reason that's a pointless exercise is because fundamentally, what I actually have from a business organization standpoint is I have two associate financial planners. They both have the same responsibilities, the same obligations, the same professional requirements, right? And if they are both measured in performance terms effectively the same way, in that light, why would I price the value of that position in the business plan and model based on your unique characteristics, Daniel, or Emily's unique characteristics, or Olivia's, or anybody else? What I should do is pay for the value of the role in the organization. And if that's a reasonable amount of compensation for you, then great. And if it's not, then you're overqualified and you can choose to take that compensation or can choose to leverage your capability to earn more somewhere else. And that's a decision you get to make individually. But so I think it's sort of pointless for employers to really hem and haw over individual compensation decisions when fundamentally every role is really worth a certain amount within an organization. You can create bonus compensation, variable compensation. We can give little adjustments for experience or certain certifications or licenses. But fundamentally, if two people have the same job title, their compensation should not be miles apart. It should be fairly similar for accepting certain nominal adjustments for just certain valuable items. So I think it's much more important that when you are hiring as an employer, that you have a certain pay range and you have very explicit criteria about where somebody's going to land in that pay range based on those criteria. And that otherwise you don't really build compensation around individuals, because in turn, in states like Colorado, California, or in the city of New York, you can get in a lot of trouble for trying to individually price certain positions in non-objective, entirely subjective ways. And it's just a lot of work that creates a lot of friction, that creates the potential for conflict, resentment, etc. Or alternatively, you can price every role appropriately in market consideration and so on, hire people who are qualified to do those things, and they can determine whether it makes sense for them or not. So I save myself a ton of time, energy, and hassle by saying, here's the pay scales. Daniel, you know what Emily makes because you know who Emily is. Emily knows what Olivia makes because we know who Olivia is. Right? Olivia knows what you make, Daniel, because again, we have all this data just available in the employee guide. There's no secrets here. And we also know what it takes to then get a raise, get a promotion, and so on within that construct. And so that's where I think it's beneficial, is having an open culture about compensation helps everybody understand what they're paid, why they're paid what they're paid, and how they can do something about it if they want more.
Yeah, it's one of those things. For anybody that's interested, you can find out how much pretty much we're all paid. It's in our employee guide. But I remember when I started thinking that that might be weird, I was like, "Ah, everyone's gonna know how much everyone makes." It's very normal, and I think probably something that can be more normalized. And I think I'd want to wrap this up with one final question, which is, um, I think I also see it in older generations. It seems like they're less inclined to have these conversations, and younger generations of folks become more comfortable. But how can we start to normalize them? Whether it's your family, friends, or colleagues. The answer was yes for all three. There should be some degree of a conversation. So how do we, as people who are already so normalized to having these conversations, make them more normal for people that aren't us?
I think the basic answer here is be willing to answer the question when you're asked. So if your colleague comes to you and says, "Hey, I'm trying to get your job, right? You're above me in the organization, and I'm not like your job, like the same title, same position, just on a different team somewhere. Can you share with me? Can you give me some idea, what do you make? Just be willing to answer the question. So yeah, I make $23 an hour in this position. Oh, thanks, man. Because I thought I might get like 20, but it sounds like I'd be in a good place to ask for like 21, 22. You're a little more experienced than me, but like that's reasonable. Okay, that's super good for me to know. Like, just be willing to answer the question, and in turn, when it's valuable for you to know the answer, be willing to ask the question. And don't, if somebody says no, that's fine. That's their prerogative. They can say no, but just be willing to have an open conversation and don't get like weird about it. Don't get emotional about it. Don't really over. Don't get into conversation like, oh, that seems crazy to me, or that just seems so unfair. Just be willing to have the open conversation. Try to leave judgment at the door, whether it's good or bad, right? And just share that information, and then use it in a way that's productive for you. And I think that's the basic thing is just let's just take the stakes off of it. Let's just keep it from being weird, right? And let's just say like, oh, like what do you make? Oh, I make this much. Okay, cool. Thanks for sharing, right? Well, what do you make? Oh, this is how much I make. Okay, interesting. Like, and just leave it at that. It doesn't have to be a big weird thing, but just make it a simple point of conversation, right? And that's all you really need to do.
I think that segues nicely into the last thing I wanted to talk about here. It's the age old question and thought. It's how do I separate my self worth from what I'm literally worth from a monetary standpoint. And I think a part of it is the conversation we just had. It's this I tell somebody how much I make or how much I'm worth or how much I bought my house for or whatever. And they in their head mentally put themselves on top of me because they earn more, have more, or are quote unquote doing better. And it's easy to say, you know, comparison is the thief of joy, and we should worry about the things we have and be appreciative of them as opposed to looking out the window and seeing what other people have. It's easier said than done. We all compare ourselves to other people, other situations. And, I thought it would be worth just speaking about for a couple minutes here is, do you think it's easier said than done? Is it one of these things that's we kind of learn at a young age that maybe we have to outgrow?
I think it is easier said than done, but that doesn't mean it's not worth trying. I think it's easy when you are living in a state of scarcity to align wealth with self worth, right? To think to yourself, like, well, I'm having a hard time making ends meet, or I don't feel like I'm getting ahead. And to sort of be envious of people who seem to have enough, whatever enough is. And we see this because the goalpost always moves, right? People who are earning a certain amount of money will always say, well, if I made $20,000, $30,000 more, I'd be happy. That's all I'd need to be happy. And the people who are making that much say the same thing. If I was making $40,000, $50,000 more, I'd be happy. The people who are making $40,000, $50,000 more, right? If I was making $60,000, $70,000 more, I'd be happy. Like, the goalpost never runs away. And it's fascinating because you have these studies where people will be asked based on different levels of wealth, how much money does it take to be rich? So people who have less than $1 million say $1 million, I'd be rich. People with $1 million say $2, $3 million, I'd be rich. People with $2, $3 million say $5, $10 million, I'd be rich. It's this constantly moving thing. And so to come back to the kind of the core of your question, wealth is just, again, permission. It's a reflection of the life decisions we've made, of the career decisions we've made, of our saving and investing behavior versus our spending and consumption behavior. And there's no intrinsic moral value to any of those things. But I think it's important then that we also have to take ownership for where we end up in our finances. Some people are born on third base. Good for them. You have no power over that. All you can do is make decisions that affect your individual situation. And we gain nothing by being upset at ourselves for the decisions we made, nor do we gain anything for valuing people more or less because they've made better or worse decisions than we have in a financial sense.
What do you think about playing status games? Right. So I bought this nice car because I one can afford it, but two, I get satisfaction in some way out of knowing everybody sees me driving this car. If you want to make an argument for it, you can say, well, if that genuinely makes you happy, fine. But on the other end, if you're like, well, I bought this material so other people know I have it, it kind of becomes a gray area per se. I guess like how do you you think about that, because we all probably have something that's material that we value more than others, and like that other people probably see that we have.
I mean, succinctly, who cares? Like good, if you want to buy a Corvette and drive it around and show it off, good for you. Now, I don't support that as much if you can't really afford the payment on it and you're really overextending yourself to show off an ostentatious lifestyle that isn't real, right? Or if you're going into like super deep debt to demonstrate a certain lifestyle that you can't actually afford, but assuming the just the basic premise of it's within your means and it's perfectly reasonable for you, good for you. Who cares, right? Like, oh, I don't like Coke. I'm more of a Pepsi person. Good for you. Who cares, right? Like, your consumption does not impact me in any meaningful sense, or your desire to forego consumption does not impact me in any particular sense, right? I think it's much more meaningful that we all acknowledge that we all are different people who want different things, and the Instagramification of the world sort of puts this tough comparison thing where it just seems like everybody else on earth is living their best life and we're not living as good a life as them, but we're always just watching the highlight reel. And so in that sense, to the core of your question, if somebody wants to buy the nice car or buy a bigger house or whatever it is, and it's a reasonable choice for them financially, good for them. It doesn't matter to you in the slightest. And if you think it does, check yourself. Other people's lives you are not responsible for in that way. And really, if you're deriving your sense of self-worth from how other people express their wealth or their lack of wealth, mind your own business.
And I think an important thing there too is, if I were to draw this out, right? I draw one pie chart and it has two pieces. One is net worth, the other is, say, income. But then I draw a second one and it has, say, eight slices, and it's net worth, income, physical and mental health, relationships, impact in the community, etc. Right? And it's one person might draw their worth as an individual from the first pie, which is their net worth and their income. It's how much they earn and how much they keep. But in reality, it's so much more than that. It's how we feel on a day to day basis. The work we do, does it provide us meaning and fulfill us in a genuine way? Do we have impact in the community and feel as if we're bigger than something than ourselves? Are we in good shape? In all these various things, our relationship with our family. And I think sometimes it's important just to realize that that is what being rich really looks like, in addition to obviously saving and investing and living below your means in a frugal way. But it's a lot more than just the dollars and cents.
Is there a question in there?
No.
No, it's a really good point. At the end of the day, the key thing here is you can derive value and worth and meaning from anything. Other people's can value other things that are different than you, and as long as everybody's happy and we're not somehow trying to hold it over each other, that's great, right? Find the value in life and the meaning in life and the things that are important to you. If money is that thing, good for you. If money's not that thing, good for you, right? But just being mindful that at the end of the day, we can all define success in different ways and experience success in different ways. What's important is that we're trying to get to where we want to be in life and enjoying the path along the way.
There it is.
Well, on that point, Daniel, now that we've had these deep, insightful conversations about how to raise children that neither of us have, and discussing money in every degree from family to practical strangers, what do you have to share with the audience? What have you learned over the last couple of weeks that you think is valuable for people to think about?
We had kind of spoke at the end of last week, unrelated to this conversation. Um, but one of the things we discussed and I was talking about is how a lot of people, especially from my past life in New Jersey, would say that there's a small barrier between my thoughts and what comes out of my mouth. And essentially just saying I lack a filter. And in a friendly setting, that's okay sometimes, if you're just in a nice, comical way saying things to your friends. However, it's considerably different in a professional relationship when you have to say the thing and they're paying you to say the thing, but you really don't want to say the thing. Whether it's the fact that they're living considerably above what's reasonable for them, whether their goals are overly ambitious and they need to scale back their life, or whatever the case may be. Um, I'd say in a funny way that they pay us to tell them they look fat in the dress, right? It's our job in a certain way to bring up the uncomfortable things or the not fun conversations, when they need to be had. Because if we don't do it, the reality is sometimes it'll never happen if we don't.
Well, and to take that analogy, yes, we're paid to tell them that they're fat in the dress, right? That you're not managing your money correctly, or that you're not going to obtain the outcome that you want. That's part of the truth telling thing. But there's an and. The and is you look fat in the dress, and what we can do about that is get you a different dress, or help you lose weight, or however you want to accomplish it. We want to make sure that by the end of this process, you look good. And that is sort of the process of being honest and being open, and telling people how it is or like it is, but also having not just stating the critique, but helping people effectuate the outcome they're looking to obtain.
100%. And that's a great way to close the analogy out, is they pay us to tell them the thing, but it's also on us to help provide them alternative solutions and a path forward, right? These are long-term relationships we're engaging in. We're not going anywhere, and we want to see you in the best dress that you can reasonably fit into and help you be happy along the way.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.